Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. Today's show is part two of a two-part interview I did with Kevin Randle, author of Understanding Roswell, the true story of what happened in Roswell in July 1947. Understanding Roswell is the first book that goes deep into the backgrounds of the witnesses, examines the evidence with a dispassionate eye, and tells the story in a comprehensive fashion. When it comes to the witnesses you've researched and interviewed, which ones did you find to be the most credible?
Obviously, Bill Brazel springs to mind. There was nothing in his background. I mean, he was a New Mexico cowboy. I don't know how else to put it. Down-to-earth fellow. Edwin Easley was very important because here was a man who retired as a colonel in the United States Air Force telling me this stuff, and he was very circumspect in what he would say. There were others involved. Frank Joyce was interesting, providing us with clues. It's just a whole range of people. Then we get to the other spectrum where there were people who were clearly making up their involvement. Walter Hott is problematic now. And the reason I say that is originally he said, well, all I did was do the press release. I didn't know anything else. Then around 2000, he began to talk about, well, he had seen the body and he'd seen the craft, and he did an affidavit. I think Don Schmidt actually wrote the affidavit based on what Brazel was telling him. And I have no problem with Don writing the affidavit, you understand. I mean, he put it in a coherent fashion. But if you go back and you listen to the interviews on tape or DVDs or whatever medium they happen to have them on, Walter kind of meanders and he contradicts himself from one paragraph to the next or one sentence to the next. Go into this in, of course, Understanding Roswell, but there was a guy I interviewed, Richard Harris, who was a finance officer in Roswell in 1947. And they were in the hangar where the bodies were supposed to be located. And Walter Hott said to him, you want to see the bodies? And Harris put his hand on the door knob to open the door, and he decided he didn't want to see the dead bodies. So he didn't open the door. That story was irrelevant to me, except he started telling that story. Harris told me that story in 1996, I think it was. Walter Hott mentioned nothing about the bodies or seeing the bodies until 2000. So Harris couldn't have gotten the story from Walter Hott as some way of confirming things because he was telling me that story before Walter Hott had come out and mentioned that he had seen the body. So it's kind of an interesting thing there. So Walter Hott's kind of problematic in that respect. We don't even know if he wrote the press release because he was kind of ambivalent. He didn't know whether he went to Blanchard's office to pick it up. You don't know if he went to Blanchard's office and got notes. He couldn't remember if Blanchard had phoned him over phoned the information to him over the phone. All we can say is he did release the press release to the media in Roswell, and he wasn't even sure if he'd taken it around to them or phoned it to them. I suspect he phoned it to them because there was another one, George Walsh, who was at KSWS radio in Roswell. And Joyce and Walsh were kind of competitors there. Walsh got it on the wire first because they had the wire service in their office, and Joyce had to go to another place to wire it to their main station up in Albuquerque. So Walsh was out about 15 minutes before them. There are some disagreements in it. And it strikes me is that if Walter Hott had phoned around, they would have been scribbling notes. So you'd expect those variations in the way the notes were taken. I mean, it's nothing big, nothing great, big discrepancy. It's just little variations. And then you got to worry about the newswire guys, editors getting it and them changing it around a little bit. But Walter Hott was responsible for getting the press release out to the media. And he was a very important witness as well. Frankie Rowe, who was the daughter of one of the firefighters, became an important witness. I think she was very, very sincere in what she told us about what was seen. She was very, very, very good. Phyllis McGuire, the daughter of the sheriff, she was in the office when it came in. Her sister's daughter, Elizabeth Toll's daughter, Barbara Duggar, provided us with some information about what was going on in the sheriff's office at the same time that she'd gotten from her grandmother when they were talking about this at one point. Inez Wilcox, the sheriff's wife, George Wilcox had died before we got to interview him. She had done a magazine article. I think she had visions of submitting it to Reader's Digest. It was called 4 Years in the County Jail. And it was about her time as the matron. I guess often in New Mexico, if you elected a man sheriff, his wife became the matron. And as I said, they lived above the jail. So she was involved in it as well. And she'd written this article. There's no date on it, which is too bad. And there was a long paragraph about the crash saucer and little men. I'd be more excited about it had it been in the original manuscript, but it seemed it was added sometime later because the way she put together the manuscript. Again, all this is covered in detail in the Understanding Roswell, so you can read what she had written and how it all transpired. But you're looking at those people and they're doing their best to tell you what happened 35, 40, 45, 50 years later. I have a hard time remembering what I had for breakfast. Actually, I don't. It was Cheerios, but that's a whole nother argument. But they're trying to recall something that I think in psychology, they call it a flashbulb memory, some important event. Challenger exploded. People remember what they were doing. It's a flashbulb memory. You can't remember much around it, but you remember that event. You may not remember it accurately, but you remember the event. And so that's the kind of thing we're dealing with. The Proctors. Loretta Proctor was important, and she was very helpful. She lived out there. I think she was the closest neighbor to Mac Brazel, for example, and told us some things. Talking to the ranchers, they were all very, very down to earth in their memories of what had happened. Marion Strickland described how Mac was at her house one day, and they were sitting in the kitchen as she was preparing coffee, and Mac was sitting there talking to her husband, talking about being held in jail. And she remembered that very vividly, about hearing that part of the conversation. We know he was gone for 4 to 6 days because when Bill Brazel got there was nobody there. And we think based on the timeline, he got there about 2 days later, and then Max showed up some 4 days after that. So he was gone like 6 days. So, there's some very, very important witnesses. Some of the other officers involved, Joel Briley became the operations officer, had a bit of a working knowledge with it. I don't think he was as directly involved as he would have been had he been the operations officer when the crash took place. He became the operations officer like 2 weeks afterwards. The funny thing is we missed a bet. There was a guy named Dalton Smith, and I got an email from somebody asking me, he said, my neighbor was Dalton Smith. He retired as a colonel, passed away a number of years ago. And he was talking about how he had been in Roswell in 1947 and he knew Jesse Marcel. And that name had never surfaced. I mean, this is like 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago. I get this information from the guy. So I go to the yearbook to look him up because we have a yearbook for 1947. So the people who were there in the summer of 1947, they're in the yearbook. But Walter Haut said 10 to 15% aren't in the yearbook. So the next thing I did is I went to the telephone directory. We have a base telephone directory that was printed. Sure enough, there was Major Dalton Smith right in there in the phone book. Not that far from Jesse Marcel's name, by the way. And so I'm looking at the phone number. I said, well, I'm going to see what other phone number that matches or is close to his. His was 3112. And so I'm looking through that and I get up to Marcel and his is 3112. Marcel shared an office with this guy. We'd never heard a word about him. Never heard a word. He's in the office with Marcel. Think of what he could have told us if we'd known that. We chased a guy named Breeze. The name had come up as an assistant to Marcel. And by the time we got in the investigation, he died, so we couldn't get to him. But we talked to Sheridan Cavett. Cavett said, no, it never happened. He didn't chase balloons, which was a bald-faced lie, and we could prove he chased balloons because we've got the documentation to prove it. And Louis Rickett was the NCOIC, the non-commissioned officer in charge of the counterintelligence office. He was the highest-ranking NCO in the office. And he played an important role telling us what had transpired and that he and Cavett had gone out to the debris field and that sort of thing. I have an interesting letter. They corresponded. Rickett and Cavett corresponded after Don and I had met with Cavett in Sierra Vista, Arizona. And there's some interesting talk in that letter suggesting that Cavett was involved in the recovery operation. Kind of have to read between the lines, but he says things, well, you and I know what really happened, that kind of thing. That's kind of a comprehensive list. Oh, it's not a comprehensive list. It's a short list of some of the people who were important that we talked to.
As far as the alien beings recovered from the site are concerned, as many people claim, what happened with them, what was done with them, and where are they today?
We run into a little problem with that because we got so many people claiming to have seen the bodies who obviously did not, and people who are claiming to have been involved who obviously weren't even in Roswell at the time. One guy said that he'd been flown in on a special mission and he brought his kid with him and they went out to the debris field. I'm thinking, nah, that never happened, pal. Sorry, I'm going to believe you. Best information we have is based on what General Exxon said. Now, Exxon wasn't involved in Roswell in 1947. He was at Wright Field in 1947 as lieutenant colonel, but he was there to hear what people were telling him, and he had some direct firsthand knowledge as well. And there's Melvin Brown, couldn't remember his last name for a minute there. Melvin Brown, who was in the truck that took the bodies from the crash site into the base hospital. And there's some discussion that one of them survived and he walked in. Frankie Rowe's father had come home. He was a firefighter and he'd come home and told them about seeing the bodies as well. So we've got some very good information about that. Some of it secondhand, some of it firsthand about the bodies. Blanchard kind of confirmed it to a guy named Chester Lytle. Now, Lytle was a very important guy for the development of the atomic triggers and things like that in New Mexico. We talked to him a number of times. And he finally told Robert Hastings, and Hastings recounts it in his book, UFOs and Nukes. And, I've met Robert Hastings a number of times as well, but said that he and Blanchard were flying to Chicago because Lydell's wife was in Chicago. She was about to have a baby. He and Blanchard were in Alaska, and Blanchard, being a general, could arrange for a flight. And as they were flying to Chicago, Blanchard told him that there had been bodies. So we've got it from a fairly reliable source, albeit a secondhand source. So the bodies made it to Base Hospital. Now there's talk of a preliminary autopsy. I'm not sure that took place. There's talk of them being sealed in coffins and sent to Wright Field. Exxon told us the bodies were brought to Wright Field. He said one of them went to Denver. At the time, the Army's mortuary service was in Denver. You have to remember, this is the point of transition between the Army Air Forces and the United States Air Force. So at the time of the crash and these events going on, it's still the Army Air Forces as part of the United States Army. And to show this, General Eisenhower was the chief of staff of the Army, and the Army was made up of the Army Ground Forces and the Army Air Forces. And so you had 4-star generals in charge of that, and then Eisenhower's a 5-star general in both of those. Anyhow, it went to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, Wright Field actually, then goes to Denver where the mortuary service was. Now, once it gets there, once that happens, we kind of lose track of stuff. I had heard that one of them had gone to one of the bases in Florida, the one that was just destroyed by a hurricane a number of years ago, I think. There was a major flight medical center for examination. But once they get to Wright Field, we really kind of lose track of them. We can't get any further beyond that. And you talk to skeptics, what does it take to convince you there was an alien spacecraft? Well, we would like to see the spacecraft. Well, we don't have. Well, we'd like to see bodies because it'd be really hard to fake an alien body, especially in 1947. Today, it's not quite so hard. But when you take a look at all of that sort of thing, I think the people who were brought in on the examination of the bodies at that point took their oaths of secrecy. And I don't call it a non-disclosure agreement. I take it as an oath of secrecy. I promise I won't say this thing. You're under obligation not to reveal what you learn this way. We lose track of them. I have said there's two conclusions. One is they're still at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base because everybody's going to assume they moved out of there. So you kind of hide them in plain sight type thing. And the other one is there's any number of military installations in the Pacific Ocean where the military kind of owns the island. And that would be a really safe place to put them because nobody could get there except military personnel. So I'm not really sure where they went once they got to Wright Field. They may still be there, maybe somewhere else. I do know you do not destroy a unique biological sample, because even though you've got them once, there's just really no chance you're going to get them again. So you guard them very carefully.
In June of 1947, 1 month before the Roswell UFO sighting, Kenneth Arnold, a private pilot, claimed to have seen a string of UFOs flying over Mount Rainier in Washington state. Are the UFOs reported by Kenneth Arnold and the Roswell UFO crash connected?
Well, first of all, it was June 24th, I think, and the crash took place, was recovered on July 8th. So it's a matter of about 2 weeks. So it's very close. And Arnold, in his later years, kind of changed the shape of the craft a little bit. It became more crescent shape and a more scalloped edge at the bottom of the craft. The first drawing he made for the Air Force, it's more heel shaped. On July 7th, 1947, a fellow in Phoenix, Arizona, William Rhodes, took 2 photographs of an object flying over his backyard in his backyard laboratory, which was fairly well equipped for the time. He was considered a genius by a number of people, but a very, very acrimonious, abrasive type guy. So he liked to solve problems. Once he got the problem solved, he solved the puzzle, he was no longer interested in it. But he took these 2 photographs. They match generally the first description of what Kenneth Arnold had seen. So we have that connection of that sort of craft. Now, I think Don and Tom have come up with someone who saw more of the craft intact that they recovered. There was a debris field where Mac Brazel found the stuff, and then there was another impact site. A more intact craft was found, maybe an escape pod, maybe something else that had that heel shape to it. So we do have that connection, although I think it's very tenuous, but there is a connection. But the other thing you have to remember is, and I've kind of pointed this out, if you take an aircraft carrier, for example, and it's carrying all kinds of different airplanes, and so you have jet fighters on it, and you have propeller aircraft on it. You can have a P-3, which has that big dome, the big circular thing on top, which is a radar device that spins, and they can pick up all kinds of signals. You have helicopters. You've got that aircraft carrier, and people would say, well, I saw this thing and it looked like this, or I saw this thing and it looked like that. Well, you don't get matching descriptions because you have all these various other craft. And what fell at Roswell, I don't think of as an interstellar craft because it just didn't seem to have the size necessary. I always think in part of a craft from a mothership that came down. And that's my speculation, you understand, because I don't understand the dynamics of interstellar flight. It may not be that hard to fly interstellar distances once you figure out how to do it. So you don't need this big, massive ship. You can, you make it in a day, day and a half. You bring your stack lunch. I don't know that. I'm just speculating that it makes more sense to me that you've got, because of the number of sightings and all of the things going on in June and July of 1947, it makes more sense that you've got some kind of a larger craft issuing out these smaller craft of various kinds and various shapes, doing their research on the warlike peoples of Earth.
The Roswell case has inspired, regretfully, several hoaxes that received international coverage. Could you, Kevin, tell me about some of those hoaxes?
There's been some little ones. There's been some great ones. The alien autopsy is one of those great hoaxes that it inspired. Here's the bodies from Roswell. And the initial story was, well, we have 18 3-minute canisters of film. In one of those films, we have Harry Truman walking out on the debris field. And you go, wow, that's going to be great. And when all is said and done, we've got 20 minutes of film, and the people who actually created the film have come forward and said, here's how we did it. We have pictures of them creating the aliens and all of that sort of thing. And one of the things that bothered me when I first saw the videos, they had wreckage in a tent display. They talk about the I-beams. Now, the I-beams that Jesse Marcel and other people described, Jesse Marcel Jr. described, were very, very small and really not much of an I-beam. It had sort of an I-beam effect, but what we see in this wreckage was this massive I-beam with alien writing on it. But if you look at it, it says video. Now, what are the odds that you're going to have a piece of wreckage from an alien craft that's going to have an English word on it? Now, it's stylized and you have to look at it, but it clearly says video. I mean, I saw it right away. That says video. I think it's a clue that this is a hoax. The other investigation came up with problems with it. Autopsies were photographed in color at that time, especially important autopsies were photographed in color. You've got no way to identify the men doing the autopsy. The autopsy seemed to me to be very cavalier in the way they did it. I would think an autopsy of an alien being would take days to do, and they do it in an hour and a half based on the clock on the wall. They come to the eye and they said, oh, what's this? And they pull this little piece of skin or something, translucent membrane, that would be a better term, off the eyes if it's protecting the eyes from the sun and things like that. It was way too cavalier. There should have been a still photographer in there as well. Still photography going on in multiple cameras, especially something this important. They talked about how, well, you can interview the cameraman, and they had put out a transcript of the cameraman. And I read that over. I said, this guy's British. He's not an American. And they're trying to protect his name. And I said, the Army knows who he is. If there's really a cameraman who did this and he saved 18 canisters of this film, this top secret film, they know who he is. They may not have known that he escaped with 18 canisters of top secret film, but they know who he is because they can go back to the records and say, well, here's the crew that was involved in the autopsy, and here's the cameraman. So that was not protecting him. And the interviews never really took place. And it was clear it was not a former military man from the United States. One of the things he said, well, when I was in the services, well, that's a British term. We'd say when I was in the Army or the Navy, whatever. Another hoax was the MJ-12 documents. And I think they were more cleverly put together, but there were problems in it. I found a number of what I think of as poison pills, things that were completely anachronistic for the time. One of the things that bothered me was a guy named Todd Zeckel. He found a guy named Robert Willingham who claimed that he was involved in a crash near Del Rio, Texas originally it was 1948, and then it became 1950 and finally 1955. But Zeckel wanted to do a book about this crash because of the Roswell incident book. He wanted to do a book about this Del Rio crash, and he was in contact with William Moore. So when the MJ-12 documents come out, there's a paragraph about this other crash that takes place in the El Indio Guerrero area of Mexico, which isn't all that far from Del Rio, Texas. So here is this story that was clearly made up in 1968. I think the first mention of it is in the Skylook magazine, which was the forerunner of the MUFON Journal. And it's the March 1968 issue. And I think the paragraph is on page 3 about him seeing this UFO, or how he was involved in this UFO. He changed the story significantly. But here's this paragraph in the MJ-12 documents that shouldn't have been there, especially if the crash took place in 1954. This document was for President Eisenhower, supposedly, as a president-elect, to brief him on this stuff. So that shouldn't be there. there. Zeckel was of the opinion, and I don't hold Zeckel's opinion in very high esteem, that Moore had put it in there to quash any attempt of him selling a book. Well, here it's in the MJ-12 document. There's really nothing there. The whole thing is incinerated, that kind of thing. But MJ-12 grew out of that to literally thousands of documents, thousands of pages of documents, most of which are what I think they call an emulsion, which means you take a historical document, a legitimate document, and you retype it and you insert the fraudulent information in it. And then it becomes that. And then you have to find, if you find the original document, you say, well, this was inserted in it later. There was a movie not long ago about a woman who was a fairly successful author, but her talent faded, or the interest of publisher faded, and she started talking about how she was friends with all these other artists, and she would produce letters that they supposedly written. And then she was meeting with movie people and things like this. And what she would do, she had all these old typewriters, and she had old stationery, and she would type up these letters and sell them to autograph seekers and that sort of thing for hundreds of dollars. And it was all a big hoax. We've got the Clifford Irving diaries or autobiography of Howard Hughes, which was completely fabricated. So that happens all the time in other arenas. And in fact, on my blog, I talk about did Davy Crockett surrender at the Alamo? Because there's a document that came out, it surfaced, I think, in the mid-1950s. De La Pena diaries. He was supposedly in Mexico. There was a Mexican officer named De La Pena who supposedly kept a diary, and this thing surfaced in 1950 and said Davy Crockett surrendered at the Alamo. And if this is supposed to be a big bad thing about Davy Crockett, and I'm thinking if I'm standing in the Alamo and everybody around me is dead, I'm probably going to surrender too. There's not much more you can do. Everything has gone that way. But there's also testimony that he was not executed by Santa Anna. I think somebody may have called and said he was Davy Crockett in the hopes of escaping execution. But the De La Pena diary, I'm convinced, is a hoax that was perpetuated on the Texas Revolution. I think the statistic, and I read that somewhere, that 50% of the documents relating to the Texas War for Independence were fraudulent. So the point simply is any big event is going to produce this kind of thing. So we have big things going on in the Roswell case, like I mentioned, MJ-12. I'm convinced that's a hoax. We have the alien autopsy, which I was convinced a hoax. And there's other little hoaxes, people putting themselves into the story. And sometimes we get fooled by it. Frank Kaufman fooled Don and me for the longest time until Don Schmidt, Mark Rodiger, and Mark Chesney were in Roswell, and Frank Kaufman had just died. And his wife, Juanita, very nice lady, asked them to go through his papers to see if he had any contractual obligations that needed to be met as part of closing the estate. And they found the evidence that he was not who he said he was. Meaning he told Don and me he had been a master sergeant trained in intelligence, and they found his original separation papers. He'd been a staff sergeant trained in administration. He had no intelligence background. Some of the documents that he presented as being authentic, we were able to later show weren't. There was a big article that Mark Rodiker and I did about that in the International UFO Reporter around 2001, 2002. I forget exactly when that was published, but it outlines this whole thing with Frank Kaufman's tales. I know the skeptics rejected his story immediately, but I always thought their rejection was not based on evidence. It was rejected on the idea there can be no alien visitation, ergo anything that suggests otherwise is a lie. Unfortunately, they were right about Kaufman, but for the wrong reasons. But that's the other thing. It was those of us investigating the Roswell case who exposed those lies. We had the same problem with Glenn Dennis, the Roswell mortician. I don't believe his story. And it boils down to major changes in his story about that. And what we think is he did work in the Ballard's Funeral Home in Roswell. It's on South Main Street for those of you who are interested in those sorts of things. But he was not the mortician. He was embalmer. I don't know if that's entry level or not. I don't know the rank structure of the funeral home, the hierarchy, I should say. But it's clear that something went on at Ballard Funeral Home. And I think that Glenn Dennis, I think Don follows this as well. Tom, not so much, heard the story from that guy and kind of plugged himself into it. Got some of those people who plugged themselves in the story that didn't really belong there. That hurts the story. And so in Roswell in the 21st century was my first look at it as a cold case, and then understanding Roswell was the culmination of looking at all this information in depth, trying to lay it out in, as you said, a dispassionate fashion so that people can understand exactly what's going on. If you want to really know what happened at Roswell, and you don't want to get immersed in all the nonsense that goes on, you need to take a look at understanding Roswell Roswell because I tried to eliminate the nonsense, even though some of the nonsense is much more exciting. It's much more exciting reading about guys who were involved in recovering the bodies and guys who were doing this, that, and the other thing. But if they weren't there, it doesn't help advance the case. And we need to eliminate that so we can focus on what is important, what the testimony, where the testimony really takes us. And when you get to the bottom line, I believe that we have an event where we recovered an alien spacecraft. I would like something more concrete than just the testimonies of the people, but these people were there, and we can find no other solution for it. And that's one thing that Don and I have talked about frequently, is we've eliminated all the possibilities. We've eliminated V2 rockets. I've got a complete roster, every rocket fired in that time frame from White Sands Missile Range. I can tell you where they all went. Every one of them is accounted for. We've got a complete listing of all the balloon launches in New Mexico, the Project Mogul balloons, as it's called, although it was I think it was the New York University balloon project. They were to create a constant level balloon with the idea it would stay in the atmosphere for days and days, and they could spy on the Russians. They'd have a microphone there, and if the Russians detonated an atomic bomb, something that noisy, the balloons would pick up the detonation and could radio the information back to the United States. We've got Dr. Curry's field notes. We've got Dr. Curry's official diary. We know how the balloons were made up. We know what the arrays were. Flight number 4 never flew. It was canceled. We have that information. On June 4th, this is when flight number 4 was supposed to fly. We have Curry's diary saying flight canceled again today. There you go. That's the end of that story. It does say it flew a cluster of balloons later. And the skeptics said, well, you know what a cluster balloon is. Yes, we do. We know exactly what they were because we have the documentation from that time frame telling us exactly what it was. The cluster balloons did not have the full array. And then as I was looking for understanding Roswell and going through some of this material again, I saw the diagram of a mogul array that's normally published, not always, but normally published, is flight number 2 from Pennsylvania that has array wind targets. The first flight flown in New Mexico, flight number 5, has no array wind targets. And you have to get deep into July before you find any of the balloon clusters having ray wind targets. Ergo, there was nothing to leave the metallic debris behind. And there's nothing that you would find that would stump you. Mac Brazel, in the interview with the skeptics frequently quote, say the description of the debris, that the 5-foot debris and rubber and sticks and all of that. When you get to the end of the article, Mac Brazel is quoted as saying, I found weather observation devices on 2 separate occasions. This wasn't like any of them. I'm paraphrasing the quote there. It's in the July 9th newspaper at the bottom of the page for those of you who'd like to look it up. And I think there's probably repeated in the book. So he's contradicting the idea that this debris that they describe earlier in the article is what he found. And the real point there is that had it been a mogul balloon, he and his family could have picked it up in a matter of 20 minutes. It wouldn't have been as densely packed as Jesse Marcel and some of the others described it. Bill Brazel described a gouge in the ground. Well, if there's a gouge in the ground, it's not a Project Mogul balloon. So we've got all that kind of stuff going on. And so we've got, the witnesses who are very, very credible and the witnesses who are not so much.
I have to say you did a great job with the book. I haven't read it, and I think anyone reads it is going to love it and understand Roswell more maybe than they previously did. So you did a great job. I compliment you on that.
Right.
Should viewers of Paranormal Yacker want to buy Understanding Roswell, the true story of what happened in Roswell in 1947, how can they do that?
Easiest way, if you've got a Kindle, you can go on and get a electronic ebook and have it in a matter of literally seconds. Of course, it's on Amazon. If you want to order the book, the softcover book is available easily. The hardback version, I had to buy a copy of the hardback version to get one. It takes a little bit longer, but Amazon has it. It's on some of the other ebook sites. You want to go to the local bookstore, I'm sure you can order it to the local bookstore. I've been into bookstores lately, and they just don't have the wide variety of books that they used to carry because I think Amazon is pretty well hurting them. But Amazon is the place to go for it. If you like the book, give us a review because that helps.
Kevin Randle, I thank you for being my guest on Paranormal Yacker. It's always a pleasure yakking with you.
And a pleasure yakking with you as well.
Hi, everyone. This is Stan Mallow, the Paranormal Yacker. I hope you enjoyed the interview you just watched. To be sure you're amongst the first to receive new interviews when they're released and to have access to previous ones, subscribe to my free YouTube channel. To do that, all you have to do is press the subscribe button on your screen.